Is great, but I think she does so many other things that contribute to winning basketball, so I definitely admire that.
Did you watch the 2023 three-point contest when she went off and set a record?
The crystal trophy sparkled beneath the bright lights of the WNBA awards ceremony as Caitlin Clark stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly while clutching the Rookie of the Year award, her voice faltering for just a moment before she spoke the words that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the arena and silence every critic who had doubted her ability to succeed at the professional level. I proved them wrong, and though they were only 3 words, they carried the weight of a lifetime of rejection, skepticism, resilience, and perseverance, compressing years of hidden sacrifices, relentless effort, and criticism into one moment of triumph that would inspire countless young athletes to refuse surrender in the face of doubt. What unfolded that October evening in 2024 was more than an acceptance speech. It was the culmination of an extraordinary journey filled with setbacks, defiance, and the steadfast love of family members who saw greatness in Caitlin when others saw only problems. And what almost nobody in that audience knew was that inside the pocket of her jacket, she carried a small, weathered piece of paper, handwritten and worn from countless foldings and unfoldings over the past year, a list of every analyst, every former player, every anonymous critic who had declared she would never make it in the WNBA, and this night was her answer, her final response to each of those voices. But to understand why this mattered, one must recall the sheer magnitude of doubt that surrounded her when she was drafted first overall by the Indiana Fever. For while her college heroics had turned her into a household name, sports analysts across television networks and online platforms openly questioned whether her game would translate, whether she could handle the speed, physicality, and maturity of professional basketball, with some declaring she was too small, too slow, and too unprepared, while on social media waves of critics labeled her overhyped and predicted she would struggle to survive her rookie year. And yet, rather than allowing those words to corrode her confidence, Caitlin collected them like fuel, transforming each cutting remark into motivation for the countless hours she devoted to practice, honing her ball handling against stronger defenders, working tirelessly on her fitness to withstand contact, and sharpening her shot release to beat the speed of professional closeouts. Every moment of doubt feeding her determination to prove that their predictions had underestimated not just her talent, but her heart. Thus, when she began her speech, her tone was quiet and measured, filled with gratitude for teammates, coaches, and family members who had sustained her throughout her rookie campaign. But as she spoke, her voice grew stronger, charged with the emotion of months of suppressed tension, until finally she pulled from her pocket that folded piece of paper and held it before the audience, explaining how she had kept track of every word spoken against her, every forecast of failure, every dismissal of her as just a college star who got lucky. And in that moment, she made it clear that this list was never born of resentment, but of a deeper understanding that criticism only has power if you surrender power to it. And instead, she had transformed it into an engine of resilience. And then she began to name the doubts with facts, addressing the analyst who claimed she would average fewer than 10 points per game. By calmly reciting her season averages of 19.2 points, 8.4 assists, and 5.7 rebounds, reminding the audience of the tangible impact she had delivered, addressing the former player who insisted she could not defend at this level by pointing to her third-place ranking among rookies in steals and her steadily improving defensive rating. And each line she spoke was not bitterness but clarity, a catalog of how determination can alchemize criticism into evidence. And as she spoke, the room remained silent, hanging on her every word, the air thick with the collective recognition that this was not a typical awards speech but a reckoning, the sound of an athlete standing unapologetically in her truth. Yet what elevated the moment beyond vindication was the turn Caitlin made next, for after addressing those who doubted her, she softened, her voice trembling again not from nerves but from gratitude, as she thanked the people who had believed in her when faith in her was scarce, recalling the phone calls from her parents after difficult nights on the court, the messages of encouragement from teammates who had once faced similar trials, and the quiet but steady guidance of coaches who never measured her by the harsh words of the media but by the effort she gave each day. She spoke, too, of her childhood, of the rejections from girls' basketball teams who claimed she was too aggressive, too intense, too unwilling to conform, and how her father Brent had refused to let those rejections define her, instead making the radical decision to place her in boys' leagues where she was free to compete with her full fire. And she admitted that without those years, without the lesson that she must never apologize for being different, she would not have had the strength to endure the glare of professional scrutiny. And in that acknowledgement, the story came full circle, linking the 9-year-old girl in tears walking off a community court in Iowa to the 22-year-old woman now holding the Rookie of the Year trophy under the brightest lights in basketball. You can perceive that the most powerful moments in sport are not simply the statistics or the trophies, but the stories that underlie them, the unseen struggles, the sacrifices made by families, the countless hours of unseen practice, and the moments when an athlete chooses to transform doubt into determination. And this speech embodied that truth completely. By the time Caitlin finished, she was no longer simply addressing the critics who had doubted her. She was speaking directly to every child who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, too ambitious, or too different, telling them that rejection does not define destiny, that doubt can be transmuted into strength, and that the best way to change minds about what is possible is to show the world through action. And as the arena erupted in applause and more than a few tears were shed among the audience of legends, dignitaries, and fans, the broader significance of the night was undeniable. It was not merely a coronation of a rookie season, but a declaration of how greatness is forged, through resilience, through faith, and through an unrelenting refusal to let other people's limitations dictate one's potential. And as Caitlin stepped away from the podium with her trophy in hand, she knew that the list she had carried so long no longer needed to remain in her pocket. For every item on it had been answered not by words alone, but by the proof of her game, her growth, and her courage. And in the eyes of young athletes around the world watching, her triumph was their vindication too, the living evidence that when you refuse to surrender to doubt, the impossible becomes nothing.
Level of being the little girl who dreams of being there, and it's like through hard work, determination, faith, sacrifice, and just always remember to have fun. That's why we always.
The night of the awards ceremony, when Caitlin Clark stood before the packed arena, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched the Rookie of the Year trophy, became far more than just a celebration of basketball excellence. It evolved into a cultural moment of truth and resilience, one that revealed not merely the statistics of a remarkable debut season, but the psychological and emotional journey that had carried her to that podium. From the first moment she was drafted by the Indiana Fever, skepticism followed her like a shadow, with analysts predicting that her dazzling college career would collapse under the weight of professional speed and physicality, and countless commentators on social media declaring that her frame, her pace, or even her style of play would not survive the unforgiving grind of the WNBA. Yet rather than allowing those predictions to cripple her confidence, Caitlin had gathered them carefully, word by word, almost ritualistically writing them down and keeping them close, not to nurse resentment, but to transform them into fuel. That handwritten list in her pocket on that October evening in 2024 had grown worn and creased over the months, handled so often during lonely training sessions or quiet moments before games, and it carried the names, the phrases, the doubts of people who had dismissed her as overhyped or unprepared, and it became her silent companion as she sharpened her craft, pushed her conditioning, and tested her own limits. As she began her speech, thanking teammates, coaches, and family in the traditional fashion, there was a sense of composure and gratitude, but as the words began to rise in strength, it became clear that she was leading the audience somewhere deeper, to the intersection where sport meets psychology and resilience becomes visible. When she paused, looked out across a room filled with legends of the game, and declared, "When I was drafted, many said I wouldn't last, that I was too small, too slow, that my game couldn't translate." The air grew electric, for everyone present understood that this was not a young athlete gloating in triumph, but a woman exposing the raw truth of her journey. Then, in a gesture no one anticipated, she reached into her jacket and produced the folded paper, unfolding it with steady hands, revealing the notes and lists she had preserved. "I kept track," she said, her voice steady now. "Every prediction, every dismissal, every declaration that I would fail, I wrote them all down. What might have sounded like bitterness to some instead resonated with remarkable clarity because she explained that the list was not about revenge but about perspective. Criticism, she had been taught by her coach, is simply information, and what matters is how one chooses to use it. In that line rested a truth that resonated far beyond basketball, reaching into classrooms, workplaces, and homes across the globe. Clips of the speech spread rapidly online, drawing in teachers who remembered being told they were not clever enough, entrepreneurs who had been told their ideas were foolish, and artists who had been mocked for pursuing their visions, and they recognized themselves in her steady defiance. The most powerful moment, however, came when Caitlin shifted her focus away from critics and addressed the young athletes watching, those who, like she once had, sat awake at night replaying the harsh words of doubters in their heads. Her message was not that greatness comes in the absence of doubt, but rather that every great athlete, every remarkable figure in history, has carried their own burden of rejection, and the difference lies not in escaping criticism, but in transforming it into the very fuel that drives progress. Don't let other people's limited vision become your reality, she urged, her voice breaking slightly, a vulnerability that only deepened the impact. And then came the revelation that sealed the speech's enduring place in memory. The list, she said, would not be discarded, not burned, not thrown away in a